All right, everyone, let's go through each of the steps that we need to do to produce what the descriptive statistics are for each category of our data for our colleges. So I just want to show you here is a page of ultimately what we're trying to achieve. We have the list of data for a particular category, and then we're going to find the mean, median, standard deviation. We're going to find the min and max and list the number of classes. We'll calculate the class width. From the class width, we'll build the upper limit and lower limit of each of the classes. Calculate the midpoint, the frequency, relative frequency, and cumulative frequency. Then we will look at how many data points are within 1, 2, and 3 standard deviations, and we will provide a graph and discuss the shape of the graph. So let's talk about how we will do each of these steps here. So the first thing that I want to do is find the mean, median, standard deviation, min, max, and the class width. So typically what I'm going to do is I'm going to click down here, the plus sign, and add a new sheet. And I would rename this sheet. I'm going to do the InState Tuition. I'm going to have 2 of them with the same name, so let me just put a number 1 for the moment so that it won't give an error. And then I'm going to come over to my list of colleges and all my data, and I'm going to shift click to copy all of the data, and then I'm going to click and paste. All right, sometimes when numbers are too large, it'll give this to me. Now, if you click on it, notice the number is there. So again, like we talked about earlier, I'm going to double click and just let it auto size that column. So it doesn't really matter exactly where I start here. I'm going to say that I want the mean, and underneath that I'm going to give the mean. I'm going to find the median, and then find the standard deviation. And I'm just going to get lazy actually and do SD so it fits kind of nicely. So within the cell below the mean, I'm going to have the calculation of the mean. So I'm going to come up to the formula bar, type equals, and Excel calls it the average. So I'm going to double click average. Well, and that was a little confusing there for a moment. So I'm going to hit all of the cells, right? All of the cells in this column. I could click and then scroll and do shift click here. And that will find the mean of my numbers that I have, my 25 colleges, right? And there's my mean. There's something I want to do personally on this category because these are all dollar values. I don't really need to the nearest cent. So I'm going to highlight that, and then I'm going to come up here and format as a number. And I'm going to choose actually, you know what I'm going to do? I prefer this way, actually. So I'm going to format the cell, choose number, and I'm going to choose 0 decimal places. So I don't need the pennies. Excuse me. And then I'm going to do the same thing here. Format as a number and do 0 decimal places. All right, so for the median, I'm going to click the cell below, hit the equal sign, and I'm going to start to type median. And again, I can highlight all of these cells here, or I could actually click the column. So there's column A, and then I'm going to come back here, comma, actually I don't need anything else at that point. Right, I'm just giving the median of that column, and there's the median of that data. And then I'll do the same thing here. Click equals. I'll start to type standard deviation. So you'll notice this is standard deviation of population, standard deviation of a sample. And it tells me right there it's a sample. So I'm going to double click, and then again I'm going to just highlight the whole column, and then parenthesis to close, and hit enter, and there's that standard deviation. And typically the standard deviation, we do carry some decimal accuracy. I'm going to keep what it gave me there as the 3 decimal places. Remember, I can have 2 decimal places. Usually what you see in the textbook is they'll go 1 decimal place beyond the data value's accuracy. Excuse me. So since all of my accuracy here is to the nearest whole number, actually let's go ahead and stick with that convention. Let me format, make it a number, and we'll go down to 1 decimal place. Right, now the next thing I want to do is find the maximum value and find the minimum value. So I just like to again put headings here. So under the max heading, I'm going to come up to my formula bar, type equals, and I'm just going to start to type the word maximum. And I can see there's max. Let me double click. And I want to find the max of all the numbers in this column. And then close the paren and hit enter. And then I want to find the minimum. So again, do the same thing. Click in the formula cell, say equal. And I want to do minimum, double click, and everything in that column, and hit enter. There's something else I like to do to just distinguish the headings. I like to do some color fill. So I'm going to highlight those 3 cells. I'm going to come up under my home tab here. I think you can see that. All right, come up to my home tab, and I'm going to choose the fill option. I don't want to pick anything too dark. Maybe this kind of light blue here, so I can see, and that's still a little too dark in my opinion. Let me go with something a little lighter, right? And then I'm going to go ahead and highlight those as well. I should be able to actually, now that I've selected the light blue, just click that fill. There we go. All right, now leading towards creating my frequency distribution, I want to do the number of classes. So I'm just going to say number of classes is my heading here. And I accidentally hit caps lock, whatever. And so I want 6 classes. I'm just going to type the number 6. No need to write a formula. And then I'm going to do my class width. So here's my heading of width. So in this cell, I'm going to say equals. And what I want to do is, remember we always have to round up our class width. So I'm going to use the roundup formula built into Excel. I'm going to start typing round up. And I'm going to double click round up. And it wants the formula first, right? So it says right here, what number do I want to round up? So what I want to round up is my my class width. So that will always be, so I'm going to use an extra parenthesis here for my numerator. So I'm always going to do max. I'm going to click the max cell. I'm going to hit subtract. I'm going to click the min cell. I'm going to use a right paren. And then I'm going to divide by, and I'm going to click on number of classes. And that's going to calculate the class width for me. Now what I always want to do is round that up to the nearest whole number. So I'm going to hit the comma. And I'm going to say I want 0 decimal places. So it's going to round up to the nearest whole number when I do that. And we can see there's my class width there. Again, I want to go ahead and just color code my headings just because I like how that looks. So now I want to go ahead then and begin the construction of my classes. So first let's do the lower class limits. So I'm just going to say lower limit, and then we'll do upper limit here. So I always want the first class to begin with the minimum value. So again, in my formula bar up here, I'm going to say equals, and I'm going to point to the minimum cell. And when I hit enter, it'll transpose that minimum value to me. And then remember what we do for each of the next upper limits is we add the class width. So the second upper limit should be this prior value, add the class width. So I'm going to click on this empty cell, click the formula bar, hit equals. I'm going to click the cell prior. I'm going to say plus, and then click the class width and hit enter. Now I should be able to drag this, click the corner. So I got 1, 2 classes. Could do 3, 4, 5, 6, and there's my 6th upper limits. I want to point out to you there's a mistake here, and let's take a look at what the mistake is. So this is, if I double click this cell, you can see it's pointing to the cell above and then the class width. Now let me go ahead, come over here and hit enter, otherwise I mess up the formula. And then if I double click this cell, look what it's doing. It's pointing to the one above, which I wanted to do, and now it's pointing one below the width. And that's because these formulas are relational. Right? Let me hit enter here and explain what that means. Right? So when I do this one, it's going to point to the one above. And then this one is 1, 2 over, 1, 2 down. So when I look at this formula, it's pointing to the one above, which I want, and then it's doing 1, 2 over and 1, 2 down, which I don't want. Let me hit enter here. So I'm gonna fix that, and then I'll show you how to fix it for all the others. So let me go ahead and come back to this cell, and what I'm going to do is come up here, and I'm going to move in front of the H. So this is the cell that I want to fix, H7, and I want it to stay at H7. So I'm going to use the $ in front of the letter and the number. And when I do that, oops, that's a %. When I use the $ in front of the letter and the number, let me hit enter. What it'll do is it'll fix this cell to be exactly that cell. So it won't be relational anymore. So now when I drag and drop, There's all the correct values. So again, let's double click this guy. If I double click this guy, it's the one above, which I wanted that to move down every time. And then instead of being, 2 over and 2 down, it's pointing to H7 fixed. So it's just one way we want to fix that. And we always want to troubleshoot, I don't want to say troubleshoot, we always want to kind of quality check as we move through this work. So then what I'm going to do next is all of the upper limits. Now the first class always has the upper limit of the second lower limit subtract 1. So I want this cell, I'm going to click equals, I want it to be this cell, and then I'm going to subtract 1. I always want it to be one limit lower. So this first class goes to 3520, and then it picks back up at 3521. Now I should be able to do this the same way we just did the lower limits. Remember, the next upper limit will be the one prior, add the class width. So I'm going to click in this cell, formula bar equals, I'm going to click the one above, and then I'm going to add to that, and I'm going to click, I hit equals, I'm going to add to that, and then I want to add the class width. Now again, what we just noticed from our last problem is I need to fix this because I want H7, I'm going to do $H $7 to fix that value and not have it be relational. So now when I drag and drop everything down, it fixes itself in that case. Right, again, if I double click this, it's the one above, and then add the class width. And then again, I like to color code my headings, so let me just put those as a light blue, right? And then just verifying that all of these are numbers, and they are. Alright, so the next heading that I want here is my midpoint. Go away, email. I want the midpoint, and the midpoint basically is just going to be the average of these two. Right? So I'm going to click in that cell, I'm going to hit equals, and I'm going to do in parentheses this plus this, and I'm going to divide by 2 and hit enter. So there's my midpoint. Now the midpoint is a decimal, so I'm going to go ahead and keep the decimal value. Right, halfway between these two is a decimal, so that's that midpoint. And then I can drag and click, and the reason that that's okay is because this midpoint should point to the 2 to the left. So this one is pointing to the 2 to the left. So when I drag it down, let me come up here and hit enter. When I drag it down, it's going to keep that relational aspect of each of those calculations. So all of that looks good to me for the midpoint. Now remember, the reason we're going to use the midpoint is when we do the graph, we're going to use the midpoint as the label on the bottom axis. Now we want the frequency, so let's find the frequency. Now to do the frequency, two things we want to keep in mind here, and we'll see the error when we kind of quality check, and we'll come back and fix the error. So I'm going to click in this cell, come up, type equals, and I'm going to start to type the word frequency. So I'm going to double click. So the first thing that the frequency function wants is it wants the data, right, the array. So I want all of column A. Right? And then I'm going to put comma. What it wants to know is, what are the bins for the array, right? So in other words, what is the maximum value? So it's going to look at all of the data over here, and it's going to count how many of those data points are from 0 and then ending at the upper limit. So it's going to basically find in here all of the data points from 0 to 3520. It's going to count them, and then it's going to give me that value. So there's one that is in that realm. Now just to double check, I'm going to do some quality check here. So I'm going to come over to my column, and I'm going to sort this column just so I can double check and make sure I'm not making errors. So I'm going to sort from smallest to largest. So I can see up to 3520, there's only this one data point. This one is beyond 3520. So it's counting that well. Let me go ahead and center how I like to center. Now I'm going to do the same thing here. Now actually, let me go ahead and drag and drop. So I'm going to pull down, and we're going to notice an error here. All right, so it's giving me a frequency of 2, and here's the error. So between 3521 and 5854, I should only be getting this one value, and it's counting 2. And here's the reason why. So let me double click this. The reason why is it's counting, what frequency is doing is counting from 0 up to this number in K5. And of course, from 0 up to that number, it's these two values, 1187 and 4421. So what I don't want is the value that it already counted here. So the way that I'm going to do that is subtract out, and I'm going to type frequency again. I'm going to subtract out the frequency within this column and then comma up to this number here. So I don't want the values from 0 up to that number. So I'm going to subtract those out, and there's that one value. Excuse me. Now, I just want to point out to you here, if I drag and drop, we're going to have the same issue we had before. So when I look relationally, it's going to find the frequency from this guy to this guy, which is good. That's what I want. And then it's going to subtract the frequency from this, so frequency from K6, which is this one, minus the frequency from K5, which is what I want. And then it's finding all of the data in the column. So I get all of that. So I'm actually come click here, click enter, and that seems to be working. Right? Let's count how many are between 5855 and 8188. So I'll start here, and I'm going to 8188. I'll go to here, and I can see down here actually. Oh, you can't see that. I can see down here. There we go. I can see down here that it's counting 8 where I highlighted. So I highlighted these, and I can see it's counting 8 data points in that range. So that looks good. So then it looks like dragging and dropping is working in that case. We could quality check all of those, and I will in a moment, but I'm going to come down here and find the total. So I'm going to click equals, and I'm going to find the sum. What I want to do is find the sum of all of these. So I'm going to shift click, hit enter, and it's finding the sum of all 25 for me. Alright, so that's a nice way to quality check there. Alright, I paused the video for a second because I wanted to bring up a different data set to show you an error that some of you might encounter. So in this data set, I want to show you that in this frequency column, notice that it's summing to 24. And it should be summing to 25. We have 25 data points if I look over here in my A column. We're going to get 25 data points. So why is this happening? So there's some interesting scenarios, right, that some of you will encounter. And the reason why this is happening is because this last data point is missing the largest value. Notice this is 18965, and my maximum is 18966. So it's missing that last value. Now, when we did some problems in class, we noticed that this only happened when we didn't round our class width up. Now, if I look at my class width formula, I am rounding. So why is this an issue? Well, here's why, right? Here's what Excel is doing. It is rounding up this number. And the problem is there is no decimal value beyond the whole number. In fact, if I just show you in this cell here, if I do equal max minus min, right? There's a whole number, right? So when I divide this by 6, right, let me go ahead and divide by 6 just to show you, right, the class width, what's my formula? Yes. So I have, I didn't do a division symbol. So when I divide by 6, right, there's a whole number. So it's rounding that with a 0 in the decimal place. So here's how I'm going to fix that in this case. So when I come back over here to my upper limit, right, remember what we had done was we rounded this guy up. So let me show you how we're going to fix this here, right? So when we created this formula, right, for this cell, this upper limit of our last class, it pointed to the one above and it added the class width, right? So because the class width isn't being rounded up, then this one isn't going high enough. So the easiest way to fix this is instead of taking the prior cell and adding the class width, let me come up here and I'm just going to have this cell point to the max. So I'm going to say equals for this cell, and I'm just going to point to the max. And when I hit enter, it changes that upper limit. It now counts that value, and then I have a total of 25. Now the next thing we want is our relative frequency. So let's find the relative frequency. So remember, the relative frequency basically is what percentage is this number out of the total of 25. So in this cell, I'm going to type equals, and I'm going to click the cell to the left, and I'm going to divide by the total frequency. When I hit enter, there's that relative frequency as a decimal. Now again, in this course, we've typically been keeping percentages as 2 decimal places, so that looks good to me. And I'm just going to right click, choose format, make it a number, and make sure that it stays 2 decimal places. Alright, now if I drag and drop, we should see that issue that we had before. And notice that it has division by 0. And again, this is relational. So this formula was the 1 to the left, and then 1 left, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 down. So let me come up here, click enter to keep that defined. So this one is doing 1 left, and again, the same number down. So this slid. So I'm going to come up here and put my $sign before the letter and the number because I want to keep that fixed. Oh, duh, there's my mistake. I kept it fixed here. That was funny. I want to keep it fixed at M10. So I'm keeping it fixed at M10. Come up here, click enter. So now that works, and I should be able to drag and drop, and I get all of the proper ratios. Now that should add up to 1, right? Because that's 100% of my data. So I'm going to hit equals, come up here, and I'm going to sum all of those numbers, and I should get a sum of 1. So we see that we're getting good work there. Alright, so to finish off our frequency distribution, we wanted the cumulative frequency. So let's calculate that value. So similar to what we did here, I'm going to find the cumulative frequency in this cell. So I'm going to come up, hit equals, and I'm going to find the frequency. And I want the frequency of this entire column, comma, up to this upper limit. Let me click the right paren, hit enter, and there's that same value. Now if I come down here, right, I want to copy and paste. This should work, and let me show you or explain to you why. So again, we're finding the total frequency of everything up to this number here. So what I want is to start at 0 and find all the way through up to that upper limit. So when I use the frequency up to that number, it starts at 0 and goes to that number. And so this is working correctly. This is really a cumulative frequency. And remember, what we had to do here was we had to take the difference, between the 2 frequencies because I didn't want it to be cumulative starting from 0. Here, I wanted it to be cumulative starting from here, ending here. So when I drag and drop this, it doesn't have to make a difference of frequencies. It's just doing a total frequency. And then we can see we get 25 at the end. Alright, now the next thing I want to do is go ahead and create my graph. So if we come back to this page here, we can see the graph of those 2 data values. So I have the midpoints as the horizontal axis, the label of the bars, and then I have the frequencies as the upper axis there. Now I'm going to go ahead and do that same approach. I want the frequency and the midpoint. And we're going to notice a couple weird things that happen, and we're going to have to come back and fix them. I'm going to highlight the 2 columns that I want to graph, and then I'm going to come up and click Insert. And what I want to do is insert a graph, and it gives me recommended charts, but I know that I want a bar graph, and that's not a statistic chart, and I want a 2D bar graph. So I prefer the bar graphs of this nature. So let me click that value. Now let's talk about a couple weird things happening here. So check out what it's doing. All right, it's using the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, the frequencies that we have. So it's basically taking the frequency column and making it the bottom row. It's not even really doing that correctly. And then it's using the vertical axis based on the values of the midpoint. And what I want to do is switch those around. Okay, so the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to click one of the bars, which references the data. And I'm going to right click and I'm going to say select data. Now from within this menu, the data range is actually going to be the output. inputs. So this is the vertical axis. So I'm going to go ahead and click here to select the vertical axis. What I want the vertical axis to be is actually the frequencies. So I'm going to do shift click and hit enter, and it's going to choose just those values for me. Now the next thing that I'm going to do is choose the horizontal axis. So I'm going to click here to edit. I'm going to choose the range of just the midpoints, and that'll fix the horizontal axis for me. So now when I click OK, we can see what we're getting in this case is a graph where the bottom horizontal axis is the midpoint of each class, and then the upper axis is the frequency. So we've fixed the graph. Right? Now I'm going to go ahead and add a title, and I'm going to say, InState Tuition. And there is the graph of my frequency distribution where we have fixed the horizontal and vertical axes. So again, for this midpoint, I have a frequency of 1, and I can see that here. For this midpoint, I have a frequency of 1, and I can see that here, and so on and so forth. Now the other piece of information I want you to do is classify the shape of this graph. And basically what I'm looking for is like, is it a symmetric, right? Is it a normal graph? Is it skewed left? If it's skewed right? If it's uniform? So I'm going to come down here and say, what's the shape? Again, I want to fill that with the light blue. And then in this case, the shape isn't really one of our known shapes, and data points don't have to fall into a known shape. So I'm just going to say that this is not one of our known shapes here. And let me go ahead and format these cells center. Okay. So we might have a graph that looks normal or skewed left or skewed right, and we would make that statement there. Okay, so last piece of information that we want in this frequency distribution is to find the within 1, 2, 3 standard deviation. So within 1 standard deviation, I want to find how many data points fall within that range. So this is going to be similar to my frequency distribution here, but instead of a kind of standard lower limit that points to the min and then adds the class width each time, what I want to do in this case is find the lower and limit based on the mean and standard deviation. So here's what I'm going to do here, right? So I'm going to do within 1 standard deviation. Let me double click that column just so it fits that in nicely. I'm going to do within 2 standard deviations, and then I'm going to do within 3 standard deviations. All right, so we're going to have the lower and upper for each of those. So the lower limit is going to be the min minus 1 standard deviation. The upper limit is going to be the min plus a standard deviation. So here I'm going to come up and type equals. I'm going to put the min. I'm going to subtract. I'm going to click the standard deviation and hit enter. Wow, that was weird. Let's go ahead and format. Let's make it a number, and I want 0. So let's keep it at that lower limit, right? And then I don't need that thing to be that large. Let's go about there. And then I want to do the mean, so I'm going to come up here, type equals. I'm going to click the mean, and I'm going to add 1 standard deviation and hit enter. That is really strange, so let's format that as a number, and let's type 0 decimal places. So let's just fix that column width so we get some consistency here. All right, so now I'm going to do within 2. Right? So I'm going to go ahead then and click equals, click the mean, and I'm going to subtract 2 times, I'm using the asterisk above the 8, 2 times the standard deviation. So I'm looking 2 standard deviations below, and then here I'm going to come up and type equals, click mean, plus 2 times the standard deviation, and there's 2 standard deviations above. Let me go ahead and highlight those and format as numbers with 0 decimal places. And then on this one, I'm going to type equals the mean. I'm going to minus 3 times the standard deviation. And then here I'm going to do equals the mean, and I'm going to add 3 times the standard deviation. Now, here's why I'm getting a negative number here, right? My standard deviation, if I subtract 3 of them from my mean, I'm getting below 0. So it's giving me a negative number. It was totally okay. That's just what the number is in that case. So then what I want to do is find that frequency. And so the frequency is going to be similar to what we did over here. So I'm going to, in this cell, type equals, type frequency, and then I'm going to find the frequency within that column up to this number here. Oh, wait, I'm clicking to the wrong thing. Let me delete that. I want the frequency up to this number, and close and hit enter. So there's 20 data points within those two numbers. And I could come over here and highlight that column for a moment, and let's count from 6124. So 6124 would begin here up to 12820 would, let me shift click to here. Excuse me. And so actually, here's a mistake that we're noticing. This is why we quality check. I should only have 18 and it's counting 20. So you may have noticed my error and were telling me and I just couldn't hear you. Right? This is going from 0 up to this number, and that is not what I want. Right? I want between these two numbers. So I need to do a subtraction. Type frequency. I want to look at this column and I want to stop counting at this lower limit. And there's my 18 that we have. So I should be able to drag and drop this. Let's see what happens. So 24 is pointing to the frequency from here minus the frequency from here, right? And we're looking at column A when we do that. So let me come up here, hit enter, and then I will slide down here as well. Right? So this makes sense, right? The wider, the further I move from my mean, the more data I should encompass. And that makes sense. Now I asked for the percentage of data there. So here's the percentage. And then this is just, again, a relative frequency, right? So in this cell, I'm going to say equals. I'm going to point to that number, and then I'm going to divide by the total frequency here, and there's that percentage. Now when I drag this, it should give me an error, because what it's doing now is pointing to this number, and then this slid down 1 unit. So, I could drag that up, or I could use the $sign approach. And then let me drag down again. Oops. Undo that. Let me drag down again, and again, let me fix that data value there. Hit enter, and there's the percentage that we have, 100%. All right, and then I just went ahead and formatted this. I put blue above and blue on the side. Excuse me, and there's all of my numbers. So that is all the data that we asked for. Excuse me, in regards to the descriptive statistics for the categories. Now what I don't want to do is have to retype all of this stuff for every other category. And this is the reason that we used formulas. So what I'm going to do is basically paste, I'm going to duplicate this page. And what I don't really want to do is copy and paste everything with a standard copy and paste. What I'm going to do is come down here and right click, and I'm going to make a copy. And I'm going to put it at the end of my tabs. So you'll notice that it creates a copy for me. Right, now I'm noticing that it didn't make a copy. It should have duplicated, and I realized the mistake I made. Let me go back here and move or copy. And what I want to do is create a copy. And then I want to move to the end, and then it'll create a copy down here. Now what I'm going to do in this case is make this out of state. So I'm going to rename, and let's say out of state. So I want everything here to be out of state. So I'm going to replace this column with my out of state data. So let me highlight that, and then I'm going to come over here, and this was my out of state data. All right, so I'm going to click, and I'm going to copy, and then I'm going to come back to this page, and I'm going to paste. Now what I'm going to do here is right click and choose paste, because what I want to do is paste the values, and I'm going to click in there, and notice everything changed dynamically. Isn't that cool? That is so cool. All right, so that's why we used formulas. So everything changes instantly, and I don't need to retype all of that same stuff again. We see all our lower and upper limits change. midpoints, frequencies, so on and so forth, we can see my graph changed as well. So something I need to fix here is I'm going to fix the title. So I'm going to say out of state. And then I need to fix the shape. So the shape, again, these aren't formula based. Now this shape is skewed to the right. Notice I have a tail to the right. So I'm going to come up here and say skewed right. And that would fix, excuse me, well, was based on this category. And then I'm going to go ahead and duplicate that as well. So I'm going to say move or copy, say create a copy, move to the end. And then, excuse me, here's out of state. Let's rename that category. So my next category was average financial aid. I'll highlight that column, come over to colleges. I have my average financial aid. Shift, I'm going to right click and copy, come back to this tab, right click and paste the values, and all of that dynamically changes again. So again, this is average financial aid. So I'm going to say average financial aid. And then I'm going to come down here, and that's skewed right as well. There's a nice skewed right graph. And I'm going to continue this process. Now watch with me for a second, because I'm going to have an error when I do my last category. So I have the proportion of financial aid, and I have enrollment. Now I'm going to go ahead and jump to enrollment first, because these are all whole numbers and these are decimals, and I'm going to have to fix something slightly in those decimal pages. So first let's do enrollment. I'm going to come down here, right click, move or copy, create a copy, move to the end, and that was enrollment. So let's change that to enrollment. And then I'm going to highlight that column, come back to my data, highlight enrollment, copy, come back to this page, right click, paste values, and there's all of that fixed as well. And then I would just change the title and the shape there. Okay. Now what I want to do in this case is make another copy. So let's move to the end, make a copy, and I have, what was my next category? Let's see, proportion of financial aid. So let me copy that, and then I'm going to come down here, rename, let's call it prop of financial aid, and then I'm going to replace this column, and we're going to notice something interesting when I do that. So first of all, notice that all of my percentages changed. Let me go back to my data. All of these should be decimals between 0 and 1, right? Because they're percentages. So what's happening is the display. So I'm going to come here. Remember that I told this column, I'm going to right click the top and format. I want that to be a number, and I want it to be 2 decimal places. And we can see it fixed that data for me. And I really want everything like that similarly. So I'm going to format, go to number, let's make it 2 decimal places, and it's fixing all of these values. So I'm going to format, number, 2 decimal places there as well. Class width, I want to be a decimal as well. So I'm going to format that to 2 decimal places. And here's something we need to notice as well. This is why we quality check. So my format should not be, my class width should not be 1. And even though we made the format 2 decimal places, we have the roundup function, and it's rounding to 0 decimal places. So I want to change that to 2 decimal places. And when I hit enter, there it has fixed that class width. Now the other thing I need to fix is let's right click these 2 values, these 2 columns. I'm going to format, make that a number, 2 decimal places, and then we should be fixing our upper and lower limit there. So we can see all of those values. And here's another mistake. Remember that this cell here was taking this cell and subtracting 1. So I need that to be 0.01 because we have fractions, we have decimals. And that fixes all of those upper limits. Our midpoints are fixed, our frequencies sum to 25, we see the total being 100%, and then here's our cumulative frequency of 25 as well. Now over here, display wise, I want those to be 2 decimal places as well, so I can see what those numbers look like. And then there's those frequencies and those percentages. Right? I would just change the name of the graph and change the shape. Now, because I've fixed all of the issues with this decimal page, then when I move or copy to the end and I replace the, what am I looking at? Oh, that was graduation rate, right? So graduation rate. So this is our last proportion page. So I'm going to replace that column. We come back to colleges with our graduation rate. So I'm going to copy. Come back to our page, replace this column. Let me paste the values. And there's, again, change the title and the shape. And there's our frequency distribution and all of the descriptive statistics for that category. So that completes everything for the project. We'll follow the instructions for naming and submission in our course online.